My narcissistic parents told my golden child brother that he could take my house and I could just live in a camper because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. I'm a single man in my early 30s and my brother is 29 with 4 kids. His wife and I do not get along as she always likes to try and get a rise out of me by acting superior. Then turns into an extreme self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliated against her in any way. She can cry in an instant and can put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that. But she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day. So their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Growing up, my younger brother was also the obvious favorite. He developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way back then. It was obvious my parents cared for him a lot more because he got the lion's share of everything unless people called them out on it. Which did happen a fair bit by other members of the family, so my parents packed us all up and moved us about 150 miles away from them. My brother got physically abusive towards me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equal to my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had relatives that were very nosy and loved gossiping drama. So my parents did their best to hide what was really going on, and threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out. But couch surfing was far better than living with them. I was low contact ever since leaving home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I really didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of the family. Then, I ended up losing my job and couldn't afford my condo. Had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize to an extreme. But I had a plan. I own a truck, so I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it far longer than I ever thought. I originally was hoping to be able to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still reside as well. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house, and didn't want me there unless I paid them exactly what it would cost to rent an apartment in the area. That was way too much just to park my camper. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing at and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck/camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult, and I dealt with a bunch of things, everything from beggars and substance addicts, to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. When I finally landed a new job after months of searching, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces. My boss/company owner actually liked this arrangement because I was willingly available to take any shift I could get, so long as I had enough sleep. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and was working virtually every day of the week. I made a lot of overtime pay, and hands-on learned some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway into this year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor, and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The scare I'd gotten from losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to my work, and just 2 miles away found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off to set it up in the backyard. When I was fully settled in the house, I was dumb enough to brag about it on my book of faces. My family saw the post, and that's where this really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother along with his family came to visit completely unannounced to have a tour of my home. I didn't even give them my address. So how they found out where I live, I still don't know. None of my friends have fessed up, and no prior family members visited me before that. So I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home. It really wouldn't surprise me. Once I opened the door, they practically all shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists. Then they just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around, and sister-in-law had this creepy smirk that she was repeatedly flashing me. It was only later that I figured out why. It made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents were constantly talking about how I've got so much extra space now and it's too much for someone like me who has no wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house, and my house was closer to his job too. Red flags all around, I know. Eventually my brother asked me to speak privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and piled out onto the front porch. That's what finally made me realize they'd planned something. My brother, Dan, said the house was too much for me alone, so I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid number 4. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they live in the main house. Dan never once spoke of offering rent. Mind you, he's got a good job. He also started talking about how there would be changes, and even curfews, that I couldn't just walk in at any time without prior notice. If it weren't my brother, I'd think the person I was talking to had lost their mind. But Dan lost his marbles long ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me as if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I'd rent my house or parts of my house to him. Other people maybe, just so I can pay the mortgage off more easily. But certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard of this exact kind of situation in videos online many times and never once did I think I'd actually live it because I thought it so ludicrous. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law do all fit the bill for a bunch of narcissistic entitled crazies. So I picked up my phone and set it to start recording. Then just held onto it. Dan didn't even seem to care or notice that I'd done this, and just sat there with his arms waving around while talking about all the reasons why he needed my house. Then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. That's when I finally showed my backbone and said hell no. I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him on that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did. But this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I told him that my house was not up for grabs and acting like I'll let him move in just because they want it, won't make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to keep living with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got as physically close to me as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house, and he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed back in his face and said that was total BS because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids, and I don't need all the space so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything and he never even offered to pay me rent. If I let him move in, I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I was going to do this, and that I will. I yelled, as if their word was law or something. And told Dan that they did not have the right or power to give my house to him. Then right one cue my parents and sister-in-law barged back in through the front door and surrounded me to try and force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting. But to sum it up from this point on I heard the line, just do it for Dan, way more times than I can remember. In the fight I told them all they don't have a say in my life or my house and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again, and I can't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her, she just assumed she could take from me like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up bitch who never had any respect for me so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She got in one good hit on my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back kicking and screaming. She kept demanding he let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding recorded pretty much everything. So I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said that I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be, and to not come back. I told sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything, and if she tries anything, I'll press charges for assault. She screamed at me and then stormed out loudly crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and sister-in-law. I responded by telling her I won't be. My narcissistic parents told my golden child brother that he could take my house and I could just live in a camper because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. After I kicked my parents, brother and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home is try to twist the event to make me the villain. And they did try to do that, but it was too late, everyone already believed me. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again. But I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented it, and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in but I said I was recording everything on camera, and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told them to F off and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why I can't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he treated me horribly for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They are terrible parents and he is a terrible brother. Then told them to leave or I'd be calling the police as soon as possible. They all left surprisingly easily. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family moving there. Stuff in. He just waved to me with a poop-eating grin when I saw him. I was furious and told his family to stop, but sister-in-law smugly said to me that like it or not, they were moving in. Then in the most fake way while tilting her head and puckering her lips, she said that it was okay, because my mommy allowed it and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I was seething with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug beachy face. So I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my window, yelling at me to stop, and that I can't do this to her because her family needs the house more than me. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "F Dan. It's my damn house. Not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told sister-in-law if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the police arrived, Dan's entire family had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. When we went to my front door, I saw that they'd changed the lock and the old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was laying right next to it. Could they have been any more stupid leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown on all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I arrived home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I'd agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another, so Dan and sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They'd actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature was not on it. There was one, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I told my parents and Dan that it was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. And I don't think going to jail and court would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen or broken, and I'd call CPS too for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan, and live in the camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house to himself instead. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said I wanted them all out right now, or I'll press charges. I stated in a shout about how they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obvious fakes, they badly forged my signature, and I have a recorded video of sister-in-law attacking me. Those are felonies I could F over their lives with if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'd do. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids. So they have one chance to get the F out. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they could not force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said she'd put an end to this. Then she went over to sister-in-law and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. My sister-in-law instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he'd cite them for littering. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the eldest was sobbing that he won't get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids up to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with the sad family routine. You know, where they all gather together in a sort of group hug while all facing one direction. I swear, I think they'd practiced it beforehand. All of the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter and told them to keep packing. All the kids and sister-in-law turned the crying up to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out your family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorting that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he's no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me like when we were kids. Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool it or he'd be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges. He sucked in his lips and looked a mix of afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother and sister-in-law had all left. Luckily, they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes 2 cops became 4 as more drove in for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd put on my front door. Though I got another lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to get at them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that were some kind of threat to me, and I voiced that to them. Then in an overly sarcastic way I said, "Oh no. That means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys where I always get treated horribly by you all anyway. Because Dan has always been your obvious favorite. You all treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you, and suck it up." My parents were floored after I said all of that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. My mother started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me. Dan just held his kids in defeat and sister-in-law was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. Soon enough they all formed a line handing out boxes and got their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it all was taken out pretty quickly. But while doing it, my mother kept saying it wasn't too late, and I could still do it for Dan several times. Each time trying to bargain more and more to try to make me change my mind. She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. When that didn't work, she said I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around, I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil to me. Sister-in-law ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down, then sat on the ground to have a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat looking angry/sad there until everyone else was finished. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck. So before they left, I laid into my parents one last time about all of the things they put me through growing up. With 4 cops being right there, they couldn't do much other than stand there and take it for once. I even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me, like letting me stay over with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and sister-in-law ridicule me and call me a bum. Well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it free of charge, yet when I needed a place to go, they wanted to gouge me for more than I could afford just to park my camper when they knew I was out of a job. I asked them what I ever did other than being born to deserve being treated so badly, because when I finally have a bit of success in life, they want to snatch it away from me for their favorite child, since they'd rather I give everything to Dan, and have nothing for myself. I bought my house using the money that I earned. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking anything from them ever again, because clearly I will never be anything more than a doormat or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no answers from them. They just stood there looking like fish out of water. So I continued ranting and asked them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents after all of that. My father was beet red, but more from embarrassment than anger this time. My mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she is a horrible person. But if I'd called them out on all this stuff in private instead of in public, they'd just get mad at me and act like I'm in the wrong. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. Dan and his family avoided me entirely as they finished putting everything back in the moving truck. I made sure nothing of mine was stolen before they left. They all got back in their vehicles, and sister-in-law just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they were all gone, I got back online again and spilled the beans on what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try and defend their actions this time. No matter how much my parents previously tried that we did it for Dan Line, no one listened anymore. Around that time, I offered to host half the family next Christmas Eve in my new house. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother and sister-in-law's profiles. I saw sister-in-law had her 4th baby in early November and they're still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks about not having enough space while living with my parents. Probably to see if she can still guilt me. I'm sure it's driving my parents up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 loud kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over their house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan.